Welcome back to On the Ball, the video podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and our guest today is Steve Dittmore, who is a good friend of mine who has a new book out on a Nashvilleian. So I know we've got people that listen and watch this outside of Nashville, but I was
Yeah,
excited when Steve mentioned that he was working on a book on the forgotten Dodger, Gilliam, Junior Gilliam. And Steve and I have known each other probably 10, close to 10 years now,
I think
Steve.
so. Yeah.
When you were at the University of Arkansas and were kind enough to invite me to speak about Perry Wallace. So I'm glad finally a decade later to return the favor in a way and have you on to talk about your new book. I know you're joining us from, it looks like your office maybe at the University of North Florida.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining the show, Steve.
No, it's my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you so much, and I appreciate the friendship over the years and the excellent writing that you do.
I appreciate that. All right, so let's talk about you first before we get into the book. I know you are a lifelong Dodgers fan, so I'm interested in hearing about how that came about. You have a background in writing about sports, called the business of college athletics, about baseball, with your involvement with Sabre. But like going back to when you were a kid, like how did you
Yeah.
fall in love with sports? What was the role of sports in your life?
Yeah, so I was born in Los Angeles, lived born in Redondo Beach, California, lived in Westlake Village until my first grade year. And like a lot of kids, you grow up and you play sports. And I got involved in T-ball in the Los Angeles area. The Dodgers were a team in the Los Angeles area. I played first base. They had a first baseman named Steve Garvey. My name was Steve. It was just kind of a natural that I would become a fan of the Dodgers and of Steve Garvey in particular during that period. And so yeah, that was kind of it. I haven't lived back in Los Angeles since that point in time, but my fandom has remained very prominent part of my life ever since then.
Yeah. So what was like the heart of your Dodger era fandom as a kid? Like I'm with Garvey, I'm thinking like the mid 70s or a
Yeah,
different time period.
mid 70s through kind of the mid 80s. I remember very distinctly when they finally won the World Series in 1981 and beat the Yankees. I remember being disappointed in 77 and 78 when they lost to the Yankees. I even through the 88 series, I was in college at that point in time. I attended Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, was in college and remember I was sports editor of the student paper, and it was a Sunday night, and I had this little portable black and white television, very high tech for 1988 at that point in time. And um, we were in the office, and I was watching the game on this little portable television while trying to edit and do all those things. And yeah, just remember where I was when Kirk Gibson hit his home run in 1988, and
Mhm.
that's it. That's it. And I remember
Yeah.
where I
Well,
was, a few months ago when they won again in 2024.
not a bad franchise to follow. As a
No,
Brewers fan, I only have a couple of those types of memories, really.
for sure.
Um, so I know you in your professional life have worked a couple Olympics. Like how did that come about, and what was your role in the Olympic Games?
Yeah, so I worked as an intern in the summer of 1990 with the U.S. Olympic Committee, now the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. I had worked in sports information at Drake University, and my boss there had some connections with the USOC media relations staff. I applied for an internship, drove out to Colorado Springs, and spent the summer out there. Kept in touch in the Olympic movement, stayed with the USOC the summers of 91 and 92, and then got hired at USA Wrestling in the fall of 92. Moved into a role with the Atlanta Organizing Committee for the Olympic Games in 1995, spent a year and a half in Atlanta, and then spent about 3.5 years working on the Salt Lake Olympic Games, all of this in the media relations, the PR area, press operations, and decided that, I was actually reading a book that helped shape my desire to want to go into higher education. And, I remember this moment very distinctly. I was um, in the Tattered Cover bookstore in Denver, and if you remember, a great bookstore, and
Mhm.
picked up a copy of "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down" by Frank Fitzpatrick. I still have a copy of it on my
Mhm.
shelf over here, about the 1966 NCAA championship between Texas Western and Kentucky. And I read that and I thought, this is just fascinating. Didn't know everything I needed to know about that NCAA basketball championship. Certainly from a race standpoint, you got the all black, or at least a predominantly black team at Texas Western, and then the all white University of Kentucky team. And I just was like, oh, how do I learn how to become immersed in the history of sport? And how can I find a career that somebody's going to pay me to read about, write about, and talk about sports every day? And that's what led me into a PhD and a role as a sport management faculty member. And now, for better or worse, I'm in an administrative role in a college of education and human services, and I don't get to talk about sports every day. So this is a nice departure.
Yeah. I know that feeling. When I wrote my first book on Perry Wallace, I was working at a public relations firm after having worked in sports, and I missed that. And that book you mentioned, The Walls Come Tumbling Down, that was a big resource for me. Perry Wallace was being recruited by Kentucky at that time. He would have become their first black player. He was obviously really interested in what was happening at Texas Western. And earlier that day, that was March 19th, 1966, when that game was played. Perry's high school, which was all black high school, beat an all white high school from Memphis for the first integrated state championship in Tennessee. So it was a mirror image of each other at the
Yeah,
high school level, is what happened in that famous Glory Road game. All right, well, let's talk about your new book.
yeah,
Um, Clearly, you're a Dodgers fan. What
right.
before you even had the idea to write this book? What was your consciousness of Jim Gilliam, whose playing days were long over, but was still a coach with the team as you were growing up? Was he
He
somebody that
was.
you knew much about?
No, I didn't know much about him, but I knew of him. Certainly you go to Dodger Stadium and you go to any baseball park and you see a black man coaching first base. That was a rarity. I mean, it wasn't something that was a prominent thing in 19 mid 1970s, 74, 75, that time period. And I remember when he passed away, and I remember watching the 1978 World Series and seeing the little 19 black um, numbers on the sleeves of the Dodgers. And so I was aware of that. As as I grew, as I matured, and as I read more about baseball and baseball history, I became much more of a student of the Negro Leagues, and started paying more attention to the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Los Angeles Dodgers of the early '60s, mid '60s. And Gilliam's name just was always present. He was always around, but I didn't know much about him. Nobody ever really talked about him. He wasn't a superstar, yet he played on every Dodger World Series team from 53 to 66, a total of seven. He won four World Series championships during that period of time. He was the only Dodger to play on all four of those World Series championship teams. Sandy Koufax was on the 55 team but didn't play. Johnny Padres was on the 65 team but didn't play. So he's kind of standalone in a lot of regards in that way because he is this figure in Dodger history that cuts across multi generations, multiple cities, played professionally when the Negro Leagues, was in the major leagues, and not a whole lot of people knew about him.
Yeah. And so when did the moment strike you that in the midst of everything you had going on, raising a family, teaching classes, administrator at multiple universities over this time, like
Yeah.
to write this book? Why did you decide it was something you wanted to do with your time?
I just always had wanted to be challenged by it. I just always thought the idea of taking an idea from beginning to end. We write dissertations as a part of a PhD program, but unless you're a history PhD, you're really not writing a book. You're writing something that gets turned into peer-reviewed journal articles. And as a journalism student at Drake, I always fancied myself as wanting to be a long-form journalist. Maybe someday I'll still become one of those before before my time is up. But it was just something that I wanted to challenge. And I just decided, you know what? I don't know much about Gilliam. I'm going to go down this road and see what happens. Initially, actually, the first subject that I wanted to write about was Preacher Row, who was from the Arkansas, Missouri border area. And I actually had a connection to some relatives of Preacher Row that were still in the Northwest Arkansas area. And I thought that would be it. But they weren't as cooperative as I was hoping. And I thought, I really want to do something that kind of examines the culture and the society at the time. And so I got involved with Gilliam research in that, started in 2019 somewhere in there, and then 2020 the pandemic hit. That helped accelerate things in some ways because I had a little bit more free time. And then, on and off, you mentioned I had a couple job changes during that period of time. So it was on and off. I don't think I finished the manuscript really until 2023, midway through 2023, somewhere in that time period.
And that's fast. You did it pretty quickly. Like Perry Wallace, this is a man who was born in Nashville, same hospital,
Yeah.
Meharry. Um, went to the same high school, Pearl High
Mhm.
School.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the early days of Jim Gilliam before he arrives first in the Negro Leagues and then in Major League Baseball?
Yeah, so there wasn't much that I could glean from anybody that had come across him when he was a kid. He had passed away in 1978. He was born in 1928, so people were getting up in years. What I can say is that by all accounts, he never left the greater Nashville area until he joined the Nashville Black Vols of the Negro Southern League in 1945. Um, his father died when he was 2 months old, is what I've decided to go with. Gilliam was quoted in news articles after, he got into the majors saying his dad died when he was 2 years old, but I was able to identify a death certificate, and it was really, actually, it was really probably closer to 6 months old or somewhere in that
Okay.
time period when he
His dad
actually
was just
passed.
a teenager when he died, right?
Well, yeah, both his parents were teenagers. I think they
Yeah.
were 17 years old when they had Jim. So
Hmm.
he, that was the environment he grew up in. Was he had a single mother, and she went to work. He spent a lot of time with his grandparents. It was never clear to me as I was reading things he said whether it was his maternal or his paternal grandparents. Um, he grew up playing on sandlots. Found his way to Sulphur Dell, where you know he got involved there. Yeah, became actively involved, became a bat boy at one point in time for the Baltimore Eli Giants. Played actually some integrated games in Nashville. I know quotes from people like Buster Boguski, that talked about playing with him when
Hmm.
Gilliam passed away in the 1970s. He talked about that, and just you know. Was really all about baseball. He dropped out of Pearl High School after his 11th grade year. His mother said, "You can do that if you're going to play baseball, but I don't want you just out on the streets." And he says, I found a quote that he had attributed or had attributed to him was that his education really came in the Negro Leagues and in particular the Negro Southern League because he was able to travel outside of Nashville and go to North Carolina and South Carolina and Alabama and places like that and kind of see the rest of the region and see how life was in those places, and that helped contribute to his life education. He said baseball contributed to that.
Hmm. And you mentioned him dropping out of high school, and his mom said like, you can't be out on the streets, and he wasn't that type of person, right? It sounds like he was uh, pretty straight arrow,
Mhm.
a student of the game, soft spoken. Like, how would you describe the personality of this man?
Yeah, exactly. He was very soft spoken. I think part of that might have been the fact that he didn't finish high school. I think he was somewhat self-conscious about that. He didn't feel like he had as much formal education as others. That was something I talked to Harriet Kimbrough Hamilton, and so there's some parallels between her father, Henry Kimbrough, and Jim Gilliam. They played obviously on the Baltimore Eli Giants, and they both had kind of similar experiences like that. Didn't have that formal education. But yet Gilliam was smart. He was practical. He had a tremendous baseball IQ. That was something that was very consistent throughout his playing career. And the people that I talked to that were associated with that was just how much he knew where to go with the ball, knew what to anticipate, knew what the play was at all times. Never made a mental mistake like that on the field. So he's very smart in that regard. I think maybe he would have the occasional drink or so, but I don't think he was a big drinker. I never got the impression he was a big smoker, although I found plenty of newspaper ads and magazine ads in the 50s and 60s when he lent his image to different cigarette brands, whether it was Chesterfield or Lucky Strikes or something like that. He was happy to associate with it if it was going to pay him to do that, I guess.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised to see that he had so many endorsements. I mean, it's not like he was Jack. He didn't have the name recognition of some of the other Dodgers, but he still had quite a few endorsements.
Yeah, I was surprised to find that too. I mean, he was definitely the face of a number of different things. RC Cola, Beech Nut Chewing Gum, Crosley Televisions early on in his career, the cigarette brands later in Los Angeles, Packard Bell Televisions. His image was part of those things. So he was quite a media celebrity, and I don't really know what that's attributable to, other than maybe, his smile, and he didn't have anything that was negative that was associated with him. Obviously sometimes brands associate with people, they do things that they're not excited about, and Gilliam was never associated like that. But yeah.
So what was it was interesting reading about the status of the Negro Leagues at the time he was playing in it. This is as Major League Baseball is desegregating. He eventually, succeeds Jackie Robinson in Dodger infield at second base. So, what was happening in the Negro Leagues at the time that Gilliam is playing there?
Yeah, so Gilliam started, he played with the Nashville Black Vols in the 1945 season, then joined the Baltimore Eli Giants in the 1946 season. So I think he was 17 years old at that time, playing in the Negro American League. And he certainly watched Jackie Robinson integrate baseball in 1947, and I talk in the book about these different gates of segregation that black individuals needed to pass through to really be accepted in baseball. And that first gate that I talk about is Jackie's integration. Somebody had to be the first, and of course Larry Doby comes along, Satchel Paige, and others shortly thereafter to help integrate baseball. But the second gate, which Gilliam found himself really caught at, was this kind of unspoken quota of the number of black players that a team would keep on the roster. So it wasn't until after the 1957, or excuse me, the 1950 season that Gilliam's contract was purchased by the Brooklyn Dodgers. And by that point in time, we'd already seen an exodus of a number of talented players out of the Negro Leagues into professional organized baseball. The Negro National League and the Negro American League had merged into one for the 1949 season. And, even Major League Baseball doesn't really truly recognize the stats from 1949 and 1950, which I think is a tremendous injustice to the players that played there, just because they were not yet given a chance to perform in the major league. That those stats are not recognized, I think, is short-sighted on the part of Major League Baseball.
After other Negro League stats are recognized, those aren't. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
those 2 years are still not. If you go, Baseball
Okay.
Reference as a authoritative source, they don't recognize the 49 and 50 seasons. So um, he then spends 2 years in the minors, 51 and 52. He's playing with the Montreal Royals, and same team that Jackie Robinson joined for his 46th season. Um, and he's having tremendous years. He wins the MVP in 1952. He had a great season in 51 as well. The newspaper writers in the New York area, the Brooklyn area, are talking about him and encouraging the Dodgers to bring him up, and they don't. They had Joe Black, they had Don Newcombe, they had Roy Campanella, they had Jackie Robinson. They had four blacks on their team. And bringing Gilliam up might mean that the Dodgers would have four blacks in the starting lineup. If you have Campanella at catcher, Jackie Robinson at third, Gilliam at second, and a pitcher, Black or Newcombe on the mound. And they weren't ready to do that. The players that they kept, nothing against guys like Rocky Bridges or Bobby Morgan, but they were not as talented as Gilliam. And you can argue that Gilliam, as a switch hitter, as a player that played second base, third base, in the outfield, was more valuable than keeping somebody like that, and probably could have helped them in the 52 World Series, or maybe helped them in 51 win one more game so they didn't have to go to the three-game playoff against the Giants, because we all know how that ended for the Dodgers. And and but it wasn't until 1954, midway through the 1954 season, that the Dodgers actually became the first team to start five black players. Sandy Amoros was called up. He was a black Cuban. He played in the outfield. Gilliam, Campanella, Robinson, and then Don Newcombe on the mound. So they became the first team. And at that point in time, Major League Baseball still is not fully integrated. The Red Sox don't integrate until the end of the decade. And the Dodgers became the first team to have a greater than 50% starting lineup of black players. So that was kind of that second gate. The third gate that I talk about is becoming a coach. When is baseball going to accept blacks as managers and coaches as part of the enterprise? The first coaches were Gene Baker with the Pittsburgh Pirates, Buck O'Neill with the Cubs. Both of them were bench coaches. Gilliam became the first base coach after he retired at the end of the 1964 season. And then the last gate, which Gilliam never got a chance to go through, was when will baseball hire a black manager? Obviously, we know Frank Robinson in 1975 with the Indians became that, but Gilliam was never given that opportunity. But you see that it takes from 47 to 75, a period of 28 years before baseball fully gets all the way through integration from the player ranks to the managerial ranks.
Mhm. Well, and you begin the book with a scene at the World Series in 1965 that,
Right.
in many ways, just sort of encapsulates so many parts of the story, like who Gilliam is, his role on the team, his value to these
Yeah.
great Dodger teams. Can you walk through, what that
Sure.
scene means, even beyond what ha literally happens on the field?
Yeah, so 65 season begins with Gilliam retired. The Dodgers kind of forced him into retirement. He had a great year in 1963, finished sixth in the National League in MVP voting. The Dodgers had swept the Yankees in the World Series, 4 games to nothing. Gilliam was involved in several of those games, scoring runs and just kind of being a thorn in the Yankees side. 64, he has arguably his worst season statistically. It's his age 35 season, and he's getting close to that point in time where maybe it's time to hang it up. And the Dodgers wanted to move on from Leo DeRocher as a coach. So they kind of sent DeRocher out, brought in Gilliam. Gilliam said he was kind of surprised, but he was happy, and he begins the season as a coach in 65. Um, Tommy Davis slides into second base midway through May, breaks his ankle. The Dodgers are struggling offensively, and they activate Gilliam. Walter Alston, the manager, eases him back in as a pinch hitter for a while. And then ultimately, Gilliam takes over at third base. The Dodgers had traded in the offseason, they had traded Frank Howard and some others to the Washington Senators to acquire Claude Osteen and a third baseman named John Kennedy, who was all glove, no hit. But he was supposed to help stabilize the third base position for the Dodgers. Um, Alston decided they needed more offense. Gilliam was such a valuable number two hitter behind Maury Wills, could hit behind the runner, move him over, sacrifice, take a walk, whatever he needed to do. And so Gilliam eventually becomes the third baseman on a regular basis. Game 7 of the 1965 World Series, he's there at third base. Dodgers are up 2-0. It's in Bloomington, Minnesota. Bottom of the fifth, and the Twins start a rally. They've got runners at first and second. There's one out. Sandy Koufax, pitching on 2 days rest, is having a hard time with command. He's just not able to land his curveball as well as he wants to. So he's primarily going fastball. Um, Zoilo Versalles, who would be the AL MVP in 1965 for the Twins, their leadoff hitter, shortstop, had been just a pain to the Dodgers the entire series, was ripping the ball, was really seeing it well. And Gilliam at third base goes and plays a little bit closer to the bag and talks after the game about how he positioned himself, knew what type of a hitter Versalles had been. Sure enough, Versalles pulls a Koufax liner down the third base line, bounces a couple of times. Gilliam backhands it as he's stumbling into foul territory, goes down to one knee, gets up, scrambles, and runs over to the bag and forces Frank Quillisi, who's coming down from second, and gets the one out. And Koufax retires the next batter and gets out of the inning. Um, Later on in the broadcast, Vin Scully talks about Gilliam as having saved Koufax's bacon in the game. It was an underrated play. The Dodgers do go on to win 2-0, the score that it was at the time. Um, but for the bottom of the ninth, Alston takes Gilliam out of the game, substitutes him for defensive purposes, and Kennedy comes in, and you can almost hear Scully and Ray Scott, the Twins announcer on the broadcast. It's on YouTube. It's great to watch the game. You can almost hear them saying defensive purposes with air quotes, because Gilliam then wound up watching the bottom of the ninth in the Dodger clubhouse with Vin Scully, who was waiting there to interview the Dodgers afterward. And he wasn't on the field, but his most important contribution came as a defensive player there. And in players that were there, I talked with Wes Parker, who was the first baseman on the Dodgers at that time, and he talked about how it was just the right play, that Gilliam knew exactly what to do. A lesser player might have tried to turn the double play, go to second and start that. But the only real play that he had, and Scully even says it on the broadcast, that was the play. The only thing that he could do was get the force out. Um, and it just to what you had said at the beginning, it was just very emblematic. It was kind of an unsung play. He's not going to get the headlines. Koufax winds up getting the MVP of the series, and certainly Gilliam had supported him in that capacity.
Yeah. So, he's only a few years after Jackie Robinson. What was the experience that he had, as a black player in the major leagues, either his interactions with his teammates? Dodgers had a number of black players. Were the white players used to it by that point? Did he run into any problems with his teammates or with managers? And what was his experience, traveling around the league?
Yeah, I don't think that he had. Certainly, Jackie had kind of paved the way, and I don't think Gilliam had nearly as many problems as Jackie encountered. There is, I do spend a fair amount of time in the book on 1953 spring training, and Roger Kahn writes about this in The Boys of Summer, about the controversy that certain white players on the Dodgers, in particular Preacher Rowe and Billy Cox, um, expressed with regard to the fact that not that Gilliam was replacing Jackie Robinson at second base, but that the trickle effect was that Jackie was going to move to third and send Billy Cox, a white player, to the bench. And there was concern that, that would mean that there would be four black Dodgers in the lineup now. With those two, Campanella, and then potentially a pitcher, Newcomb or Joe Black. And you know, they they seemed to function well. The 53 Dodgers had a great season offensively. They were a tremendous team. There didn't seem to be any real controversies there. So many of that era Dodgers have passed. I did talk to Bobby Morgan before he passed. I was able to get a hold of him at his residence in Oklahoma City. Told him what I was doing, and the first thing that he says to me is, "You want to write a book about Jim Gilliam? He's been dead for 40 years. Why would you want to do that?" I'm like, well,
Hmm.
but he denied Roger Kahn's account of all that stuff. He kind of backed up from that and said none of that was true. But I still included the dialogue because it was all in Boys of Summer. And it
Mhm.
was there were other media articles that were there during that time. Milton Gross was writing about things for the New York Post and others. So that was really the only real controversy in Brooklyn. But then in Los Angeles, the cover of Jet magazine in the mid 1960s has a picture of a lot of Dodgers and says, "Do the Dodgers have a Negro problem?" And now it was that there were too many blacks. You
Hmm.
had Nate Oliver, you had Tommy Davis, you had Willie Davis, you had Maury Wills, you had Jim Gilliam, and you had many more black players on the 1960s Dodgers teams than you did. And there was a concern, was, is this too many now, as opposed to, not enough, or the integration piece. So, you know,
The
Jim's
sense that the white fans wouldn't go to the games anymore, or
that was part of it,
Mhm.
and Buzzy Bavasi was always fond of being able to say, well, if we had nine Jackie Robinsons, I'd start nine Jackie Robinsons. He
Mhm.
didn't. He always said that it didn't matter the color of the player, but obviously the Dodgers had a rocky start in Los Angeles with regard to race relations, everything that took place in Chavez Ravine and the Mexican American community there. So there was some of that. 1965, obviously, you get the Watts riots that took place in Los Angeles, and some of the black players. They had John Roseboro, another prominent black player, very outspoken catcher for the Dodgers during that era. Um, so from that standpoint, I guess Gilliam's career kind of had those little moments like that, but I don't think he ever felt like he was discriminated against, anything like that. I don't think he ever, talking with his children and things like that, they never expressed that he had said anything about race or any of those, anything about the experience there. The Dodgers, even in the mid 1950s, until during their spring training, they would still relocate from Vero Beach and play some games down in Miami. And even when they were down in Miami, the black players would stay at a separate hotel than the white players would stay at in Miami. And in Vero Beach, the Dodgers still had the black players still had to go to Sifford, which was the little town that was next to Vero Beach, which is the black community. If they wanted to go to the laundromat or to the barber shop or go to the bar or restaurant or something like that. So he did experience those things, that kind of Jim Crow, but he never really complained about him or anything like that that I could ever tell.
He didn't speak about it publicly.
Yeah.
And you have Walter Alston quoted as saying that he was the closest thing to a perfect ball player.
Hmm.
He was kind of like a coach on the field type of guy.
Yeah.
He was a great mentor as a coach to black players on the Dodgers like Dusty Baker.
Yep.
Um, Serves as a coach in really successful times for the Dodgers, but he never gets a chance to manage the team. Um, was Al Campanis the GM that would have hired him in that role, uh, potentially? Or what's your
Um,
feeling about why he never got a chance to manage anyone?
yeah, so that's a complicated thing. I mean, he never got that chance. He always said he wanted a chance to manage, but when I talked to Edwina, his widow, she said he was really just happy doing whatever the Dodgers asked him to do. He wasn't someone that campaigned for anything. He didn't campaign to become a manager, whereas you find in the early 1970s, Maury Wills is very outspoken about, I want to be the next manager. When Alston steps down, I think I'm the right guy. Of course, Tommy Lasorda gets that role. Um, he managed one time in the offseason. He managed one season in the Puerto Rican Winter League with a team in San Juan. Took a team that was kind of mediocre. They had a little bit better than 500 season, made the playoffs, but didn't go past the first round. And the players that I talked to that played on that team, so that team had three future big leaguers that I interviewed: Tom Walker, Baylor Moore, and Eliseo Rodriguez. So two pitchers and a catcher. And they both talked about what a great manager he was, how knowledgeable he was about the game, and how he helped him on things. Even just, the pitchers both talked about Gilliam's perspective as a base runner on first base and what he's looking for in pickoff moves, so that the pitchers could, work opposite that and try to improve their pickoff moves and things like that. Um, so, by all accounts, he was revered by that. The players I talked to that played for him, you mentioned Dusty Baker, Bobby Valentine, Billy Grabarkowitz, Al Ferrara, some guys that were on the team in the late 60s, early 70s when Gilliam was getting going, all had tons of positive things to say. Ron Say said he was a great, great mentor as well at third base and helped him with that. In terms of wanting to manage, Dusty said something to me that I think holds true. uh, Jim wasn't the type of one to seek out the media. He wasn't the one that really wanted to do those types of interviews and be that face. Obviously, Tommy Lasorda was the other end of that continuum.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
Tommy fit in well. And even Ron Say said, Tommy had coached us all in the minors. He knew us. He knew all those guys from the Spokane team in the late 60s, early 70s. So Garvey and Russell and all those guys that came up in that team, Bill Buckner and the others. So that made sense. Al Ferrara, before he passed away, when I talked with him, he said something that has always kind of stuck with me, and I think is true, that in today's baseball, with the importance of the bench coach, the person that's in the manager's ear saying, okay, three platters from now, you got to be thinking about this. That's the role that Gilliam would have excelled in. That type of mole. He was a manager on the field. I talked with Dick Tracewski, infielder in the 1960s Dodgers, and he would say, the Dodgers, Alston would never come out to the mound if the pitcher was struggling. Gilliam would walk in from his position and go calm the pitcher down. It was like having a second manager on the field.
Mhm. Now, apart from like his wisdom as a player, he was a role player, but he had some pretty incredible stats also,
Yeah,
to the not like he had hundreds of home runs, but I think you said he's in the top 10 all time in Dodgers and in WAR.
he is.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you had a line that the fact they didn't get any Hall of Fame votes is one of the worst historical slights in the history of the game, which is a pretty strong statement. But like, why would you, what can you say to back up a statement like that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I'm not suggesting he was a Hall of Fame player. I'm not
Right.
suggesting that at all. But to not have one person, I mean, it's like Ichiro not getting a unanimous vote. I mean, who's the person that didn't vote for Ichiro? I mean, how's that even possible? How is
Yeah.
it possible that a guy that played on 7 World Series teams, won the 1953 Rookie of the Year, is the only player in baseball history, black or white, to hit a home run in the Negro Leagues East-West All-Star Game and the Major League Baseball All-Star Game? A guy that is top 10 on the Dodgers in WAR, with a WAR of the mid 40s, I forget it off the top of my head. Um, a guy with more than 1,000 walks and only 400-ish strikeouts. I mean, he's got a 2.5 to 1 walk to strikeout ratio. How is it that he doesn't get at least one vote? Somebody doesn't put him on their ballot as the ninth best option that year or something like that. Willie Davis is the same way. Willie Davis and the Dodgers played for the Dodgers throughout the 1960s, early 70s, and went on to play for several more teams after the Dodgers traded him. He doesn't have any Hall of Fame votes, and I'm not the only one. I mean, Jay Jaffe studies this stuff a lot. I talked to him, talked to Adam Darowski, who has written a number of things about Hall of Fame stats and so forth. And I even did a comparison. It didn't make the book, but I did a comparison between other contemporaries at that time. Red Schoendienst for the Cardinals, Bobby Richardson for the Yankees, Bill Mazeroski for the Pirates. They all got Hall of Fame votes. Schoendienst is in the Hall of Fame, maybe more so for as a manager. But you look at their stats side by side. Mazeroski was a better fielder than Gilliam was, but their offensive statistics are pretty similar. Mazeroski, sure, he had a home run in the 1960 World Series that people know about. Um, but I guess part of it is he never had a permanent position. Gilliam started more opening days on the bench than he did in the starting lineup on opening day. But he would always wind up playing 150 games, get 600 plate appearances a couple of times. I mean, his rookie year, he had over 700 plate appearances in 1953. So he was a part of all that. He was overshadowed certainly on the 50s teams and the 60s teams by larger personalities: Koufax, Drysdale, Wills, Robinson, Campanella, Snyder, Hodges, Pee Wee Reese. I mean, he played with a lot of major players. Um, and you wonder if the Dodgers had called him up earlier than the 53 season, if he had more stats, if that would have been a factor. I don't know, but yeah, I'll stand by my words on it that it's
So
a
he was,
historical slight.
and race is inescapable reason. He's kept in the minor leagues longer than
Mhm.
he needed to because they didn't want too many black players on the team. I'm sure the sports writers, the baseball writers who are voting for the Hall of Fame were probably better pals with some of the guys they voted for
Sure.
than Gilliam. So he didn't get a vote. He's not in the Hall of Fame, but he is remembered in some pretty significant ways. Here in Nashville, our minor league stadium
Yeah.
sits on Junior Gilliam Way, right? And there's
19 Junior Gilliam Way. Yeah.
a park in Los Angeles named for him.
Yep.
Your book now is a great tribute to him. What would you say here in closing is the significance of this forgotten Dodger why we should remember him, and the ways he is remembered by those who knew him and you had a chance to talk to for the book.
Yeah, I think the things that I would say to that is, for a long time people wondered if you went to Dodger Stadium, you recognized the numbers that were retired that were on the facade of Dodger Stadium, and you didn't see Gil Hodges as number 14 for a long period of time because the Dodgers had this policy from the 1980s on that they would only retire Hall of Fame players' numbers. But Gilliam died in 1978 and they announced it right away. And at the time, the only Dodgers to have their numbers retired were Koufax, Campanella, Robinson, and Walter Alston. So there wasn't, a whole lot of precedent on this. Peter O'Malley, Fred Clare, others that I spoke with all stood behind it, said he epitomized the Dodgers from 51 to 1978, 27 seasons he was with the Dodgers. He passed away at the age of 49. It's not inconceivable to think that had he lived another 23 years, he would have stayed in the Dodgers organization and spent a half century in the Dodgers organization. That's not out of the realm of possibility at all.
Mhm.
Um, you know, his number is forever retired by the Dodgers. He's someone who, as you look at his body of work, as you look historically at what he did and contributed to those teams, he's played in 40 some odd World Series games. He just is somebody who I don't know if forgotten is the right word so much as overlooked. And I got a lot of pushback sometimes on Facebook groups about Brooklyn Dodgers fans that would push back and say, he's never forgotten. We haven't forgotten Junior. I mean, first of all, he's Junior to them and he's not
Yeah.
Jim. Um,
These are
for
people
those,
like in their 80s and 90s or what? Yeah.
correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or people, and I talked to several of them. Several went on the record with me to tell me about their experience of going to Ebbets Field and watching the Dodgers.
Hmm.
So yeah, I just think it's important to know history. It's important to understand the context of different things, right? And I think he is someone who is extremely influential in Dodger history that deserves perhaps to be talked about more than he is.
Yeah. I think you mentioned there, I mean, there's been a lot of books written about the Dodgers, but even some of the best known didn't really have much about him at all, right?
And Boys of Summer didn't have anything really. I even spoke to Peter Golenbach, who wrote Bums, and he's like, yeah, he just when he wrote Bums, the oral history part, Gilliam had passed away, so he wasn't available to be interviewed for that. He's mentioned more in there, but Boys of Summer didn't have anything about him. And when Boys of Summer came out while Gilliam was still alive, that was 1972,
Mhm.
and there's no real story in there about him. So yeah, he just flew under the radar. He wasn't seeking the attention, and it's unfortunate because hopefully more people are learning about him and finding out about his contributions.
Well, you can't tell the story of baseball without the Dodgers. Sounds like you can't tell the story of the Dodgers without Jim Gilliam, but people have tried, but now you've written this book. So the
Yeah.
story's out there. Congratulations on
Thank you
this
so much.
book. Highly recommend it. And thank you again for taking the time to join the show today.
Absolutely happy to do it, Andrew. Thank you so much for asking.
All right, take care.